Hey guys, this is Axeman and we are back in naval action doing another history video, but it's not about a ship, strangely today, doing something a little bit different. I wanted to talk about, and you've probably already guessed by the title of the video, but I wanted to talk about what it was truly like in battle aboard old Age of Sail warships, and Napoleonic era warships, stuff like that. Just because we kind of take it for granted. So I've got my little script here that I've written, took a while, and let's dive into the video. So how many battles do we fight in naval action? It is probable that each of us gets in a good few fights each time we're online, and that's probably well, as it's the most fun part of the game. Trying to outsail, outmaneuver and outfight our enemies, while hammering them with broadside after broadside until eventually they sink and we are left the victor. We then leave the battle, repair our ship, and head off to the next task or battle with little thought as to what we have just play acted and what it was like in real life. The truth is, naval combat in the Age of Sail was, in a word, hellish. I cannot think of a more nightmarish situation to find oneself in than being a member of a ship's crew in battle, broadside to broadside, against an equal or greater foe. In this video, I'm going to go over what would happen as a ship prepared for battle, the preparations and alterations the crew would make to the ship, and what would happen as a broadside crashed through a ship. But please note that this video won't go into any detail about naval strategies during a battle, merely what would be actually happening in, and indeed to, the ship. As always, this is coming from a British naval perspective, so orders given in the navies of other nations may vary, but the general ideas were the same. So, upon sighting an enemy, and action was imminent, a captain would give one of two orders, and maybe both. All hands clear for action, or, otherwise, beat to quarters. To beat to quarters meant that the marine drummers and often pipers would beat a rhythm usually to Heart of Oak in the British Navy. This was essentially a summons that would be heard throughout the ship by all hands in this context meaning men of course, and meant battle was approaching and the ship needed to be prepared. What would then ensue would look to the untrained eye to be a chaotic maelstrom of disorganised bodies frantically charging throughout the ship in a disorderly fashion, clumsily doing what needed to be done. However, in reality, this was far from the case, at least amongst well-drilled and well-disciplined crews, which the vast majority of the Royal Navy were. Every man had his duty when a ship was clearing for action, and they could vary wildly from man to man. Some men would dart up the rigging and ratlins to the sails and yards, so they were there if the sails needed to be got in or set. Others would be below decks, removing the ship's internal bulkheads, walls essentially, allowing movement through the ship to be opened up and easier. Gun crews would be at their guns, preparing them for use and, depending on orders from their superiors, loading and running them out, meaning they'd load their cannons for firing, open the ship's gun ports, and haul the guns so that their muzzles protruded from the ports, as you've seen them protruding in the game. While this is happening, powder boys, young boys usually around the age of 12, would be supplying each gun crew with enough gunpowder from the ship's magazine to keep the guns firing. The powder boys, sometimes known as powder monkeys, would do this throughout the entire battle, as it was ill-advised to keep too much gunpowder near firing guns. Other boys would be spreading sand on the decks, which would give grip to the men's feet and prevent any spilled blood making the floor slick and slippery. Any fires aboard the ship, such as the galley fire for cooking food, would be doused to prevent accidental shipboard fire. Buckets of water would be placed at each gun, both for sponging the guns, a process of using a rammer covered in wetted cloth down the gun barrel to douse any lingering traces of gunpowder that may cause a misfire, and in case a fire started near the gun, the bucket could be used to immediately start combating the fire. Similarly, buckets of water would be placed around the ship's mast at every deck level, so that everybody knew where water was available if they needed it, and also to use on the mast themselves if they caught fire. The surgeon and his mates would prepare the surgeon's cockpit by, like the rest of the ship, covering the deck with sand. As the wounded were brought here, you can see why it was such a necessity to ensure that blood didn't make the place too hazardous. Tables that had previously used to dine at would be cleared to be used as operating tables. Operations usually meaning that the poor souls sent there would likely be having a limb amputated or some other such horror. Buckets were also present in the surgeon's cockpit, but these were used for body parts and not water. Sentries would also be placed at hatchways, which led to any part of the ship that was below the waterline, and thus more protected from direct cannon fire to prevent cowards from being able to run and hide there. And after all this, a ship and her crew was finally ready for battle. Now before we continue, I want to address something first, and it is based around the single principle that wooden ships are hard to sink. More ship actions were concluded with boardings than were ever concluded by sinking from cannon shot, and more still were concluded by surrender after a ship was sufficiently battered enough. Cannon shot was not designed to be a tool with which to sink ships. Far more useful was it to annihilate the crew or disable the rigging and sails, and while sinking a ship with cannon shot isn't impossible, it is still exceedingly difficult. It is because of this that carronades were so successful as shipboard artillery, as they could cause more damage to crew and rigging, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. So let's say our two ship combatants have formed up in order to pass each other with their broadside. As the ships glide past each other, they both fire their guns and hammer the other with shot. It is moments like this that I struggle to comprehend. The fear that must sweep through a ship as it is pounded with cannon fire. The bravery of the men aboard to keep doing their duty in the face of such fire. It beggars belief. As round shot smashes through a ship, it causes the wood of said ship to break and splinter. These splinters wouldn't be the kind you get stuck in your finger that need to be coaxed out with a needle and tweezers. No, these splinters were like lethal flying daggers and would maim and kill anyone unlucky enough to be in their way. Splinters caused more casualties and deaths as they flew around the ship than did any cannonball. The noise of a broadside striking a ship was tremendous, and without ever experiencing it firsthand, likely unimaginable. After shot had smashed and crashed and bellowed through the ship, and the noise of the broadside itself had died away, then would come the screams of the wounded and dying. Injuries like having an arm or leg torn away by a splinter or ball were common. Lacerations and opened arteries, bludgeonings and beheadings, or merely being turned into pink mist. It was all possible, and it all happened. At this point, assessments would be made by senior and warrant officers, who would then reassign crew to fill the gaps left by the dead or dying. Those who were injured would be sent to the surgeon if it were possible, where only more pain awaited them, but at least a small chance of life was to be found there too. It was also common tactics to shoot at the rigging of a ship, and the men assigned to those areas were in equal peril. Men aloft could easily find themselves falling into the sea or onto the deck with a collapsing mast. Both usually meant death. Cables and ropes pulled tight could be snapped and would lash like giant whips with enough force to tear a man in half if he were unlucky enough to be in the way. Yardarms could become detached from their stabilising ropes and halyards and could sway perilously, potentially throwing men off itself into the sea or to the deck. They could also break completely and crash through the deck with tremendous force, killing anyone in the way. The ways in which to die aboard a ship in combat were near limitless, and all were utterly horrifying. But aside from taking a broadside, what would happen when giving one? When the guns bore at an enemy, they would be given the order to fire. In close range combat, which most naval battles were, given the inaccuracy of their smoothbore artillery, the guns would as near as damn it fire all at once. This would cause a tremendous lurch on the ship as it heeled to the recoil. If a ship had a gun deck of 15 24-pound long guns, each weighing 2.5 tons, you'd have 37.5 tons of artillery being forced backward on their carriages. The amount of force at work is mind-boggling, and it had an effect on the ship as surely as the wind itself did. After firing, most of the smoke would be outside of the ship, but some would always find its way into the ship too, making it harder to see, stinging the eyes and burning the nostrils. Gunpowder smoke in enclosed places was not pleasant. After firing, the gun crews would get to work on preparing their guns to fire again, including sponging out as mentioned before, and reloading. I may do a full video on the operation of a naval gun later, so I won't go into the complete operation here. And so it would continue, loading and firing and reloading again, all the while powder boys running throughout the ship keeping the hungry guns fed, the surgeon and his mates hard at work, men attempting to jury-rig broken mast and spars if needed, officers bellowing orders, warrant officers bellowing orders, and the captain himself bellowing orders. the screams of the dying mixing with the screams of the uninjured as they worked furiously to keep their ship alive and fighting. But suddenly, the two ships crash together, the noise of which hurts every man's ear. The enemy is boarding. Everything that could be used as a weapon would be used as a weapon during a boarding action. Axes, knives, swords, cutlasses, pistols, muskets and blunderbusses were all viable weapons, as were lengths of wood, belaying pins and various other improvised weapons. A ship that had been battered enough previously in the battle would likely not put up a fight. The captain, or should he be dead, the most senior officer, would hand over his sword to the senior officer of the boarding party in a gesture of surrender, and that would be the end of the battle, with the crew and ship captured and beaten. However, it was also possible that boarders would meet resistance and have to fight in order to secure the ship and her surrender. Such battles were vicious and bloody, being fought much like those by the ancient armies of old, up close with cold hard steel, slicing, stabbing or bludgeoning anyone that resisted until all resistance was quelled, or possibly even being repulsed. And after the smoke clears and the echoes of the last cannon shot fades, we're left with what? A sunken ship? Maybe. A captured ship? Maybe. It doesn't really matter. Whatever happens, the aftermath is similar. Holes punch through the sides of beautiful ships, marring their beauty. Rigging and masts sprawled across the deck or fall into the sea. Blood soaking the sand on the decks to the point of saturation. The men who are still alive and unhurt would now be going about their duty, trying to repair the ship enough to get her underway to make it to a friendly port for repairs. Other men still dying, moaning and gasping, the dead beyond help being prepared for burial. As I said earlier in the video, I can't imagine a worse kind of hell than fighting aboard an old naval vessel. The scenes witnessed by men who were placed in such situations must have been beyond horrific, and I take my hat off to them. And that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you more of an idea of what naval combat was truly like. I could have gone into more detail. I could have talked about the ways certain things were done. I could have talked about how the gun crews managed, but all of those might get separate videos, so if it didn't go into enough detail in certain regards for you, then you might get your own little video in the future, so never fear. If you like this video, please leave a like. If you haven't subscribed and you want to, then feel free to do so, and I'll see you in the next video.